All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. So today we're going to pick up our discussion on the endocrine system by talking about your different types of hormones in a more general sense. So remember that when we talk about your signal transduction pathways, right, the signaling of that molecule, in this case hormones, really involves three major events. That cell needs to get received, that's the reception piece. So where is that signal's receptor that it correspondingly binds to? We go through that signal transduction pathway in the cell itself, and then we ultimately produce some sort of cellular response as a result of that incoming signal. So, when we look at your types of hormones more in general, they fall into two major categories. So, we're talking about sort of these lipid soluble versus water soluble hormones. And your major classes of hormones fall into these polypeptides, so sort of protein or peptide chains. You'll also get amines, which are sort of derivatives of amino acids, as well as steroid hormones. So, when we look at your lipid soluble hormones, these are those steroid hormones. And because they're lipid soluble, that means that they're capable of easily transmitting through the cell membrane without the need of some sort of carrier protein or some other help getting across that membrane. Your water soluble hormones, however, are where the polypeptides and the amines fall in. And these guys, because they're water soluble, cannot interact with the fatty acid tails in your phospholipid bilayer, and as a result, can't just pass straight through. So the solubility of your hormone really does correlate to where the location of the receptor is located. When we're talking about those water solubles, the reception of that signal is going to have to happen outside of the cell itself. So its receptors are going to have to be located in the cell membrane, as opposed to the lipid soluble hormones that can pass straight through and thus can have internal receptors instead. So here's what I just mentioned, right? So the water soluble versus lipid soluble differs in the pathway in which it can travel through your body to the target cell that it works on. So when we look here at these water-soluble hormones, we'll go through the production of that protein, of that hormone. Um, it'll pass through your endomembrane system, ultimately to the cell membrane, and get released. That water-soluble hormone then can diffuse directly into the blood, travel to wherever it needs to in the body, and then bind to a receptor on the target cell surface. And then that can either cause some sort of gene regulation or some direct cytoplasmic response. When we look at your lipid soluble hormones, on the other hand, these guys will get secreted directly through the cell membrane, so there will be no sort of vesicle transfer like we see here, because they can interact with those fatty acid tails and not have to worry about how they get out of the cell. But they will run into some issues being traveling through the bloodstream, which is, if you remember, mostly water. So they will connect to a transport protein that will help increase their solubility. Once they get to their target cell, they'll dissociate from that transport protein. Then they'll be able to diffuse directly across the cell membrane to that cell's signal receptor. That receptor could be located in the cytoplasm. It could also be located, like you see here, directly in the cell's nucleus. And most of the time, these guys are working in some sort of function as directly a transcription factor of some sort. They'll regulate the gene expression, which then can cause some sort of cytoplasmic response. So, when we look at the pathway for your water soluble hormones, if we look at those more specifically, these are the ones that are going to bind to the receptors that are external to the cell membrane. So, that receptor protein is sitting integrated into the target cell membrane and then will lead to some sort of response. Um, that response can be anything from some sort of enzyme activation to potential alteration to the gene expression directly. So epinephrine's a great example of this. This is one of your fight or flight hormones. It's got a bunch of multiple effects, I should say, in mediating the body's ability to respond to short-term stress. So this is a water-soluble hormone. So it will travel pretty freely throughout your blood, but once it gets to its target cell, it's going to bind to its receptor. And in this case, it's one of those G couple protein receptors that we mentioned back in chapter 11. So that epinephrine binds here, activates a G protein, which then will go binding to this adenylate cyclase, so activate this enzyme, which then produces a CAMP secondary messenger, and then sets off the protein kinases that are here to go through that transduction signaling pathway. And then ultimately, what epinephrine's effects are in the cells are things like the inhibition of glycogen synthesis, so the production of glycogen, which is the storage of your sugars, excess sugars. It will also promote any currently stored glycogen to break down and release glucose back to your blood.
Epinephrine is one of many hormones that is water-soluble, hydrophilic, and therefore unable to cross the hydrophobic plasma membranes of its target cells. Instead, it binds to receptor proteins located in the plasma membrane and does not enter the cell. When epinephrine binds to beta-adrenergic receptors on the liver cell, G proteins on the inner side of the cell membrane are activated. Each G protein is composed of 3 subunits, and the binding of epinephrine to its receptor protein causes one of the G protein subunits to dissociate from the other 2. The G protein subunit which dissociates from the others carries a GDP, which is replaced by GTP when the subunit is activated. The activated G protein subunit then diffuses within the plasma membrane until it encounters adenylyl cyclase, a membrane enzyme that is inactive until it interacts with the G protein subunit. When activated by the G protein subunit, adenylyl cyclase catalyzes the formation of CAMP from ATP. The CAMP formed at the inner surface of the membrane diffuses within the cytoplasm, where it binds to and activates protein kinase A, an enzyme that adds phosphate groups to specific cellular proteins. In liver cells, protein kinase A phosphorylates and thereby activates another enzyme called phosphorylase, which converts glycogen into glucose 6-phosphate. The glucose 6-phosphate is then converted to glucose.
On the flip side to this, if we look at your lipid-soluble hormones, these almost always are going to alter gene expression directly in the cell, and then that altered gene expression can have some sort of effect in the cytoplasm of that cell or elsewhere. So these are typically your steroid hormones, thyroid hormones, as well as hormonal forms of vitamin D. These guys are capable of passing directly through the cell membrane because they are lipid soluble, and so their target receptors are internal to the cell, like you see the one here for estradiol, which is essentially estrogen. So those protein receptors then will act as transcription factors in the nucleus, regulating specific gene transcription, which then produces some sort of protein in the cell as a result of that increase in transcription.
Steroid hormones are not water-soluble. They travel in the blood attached to protein carriers. When steroid hormones arrive at their target cells, they dissociate from their protein carriers and pass through the plasma membrane of the cell. Some steroid hormones bind to specific receptor proteins in the cytoplasm and then move as a hormone receptor complex into the nucleus. Other steroids travel directly into the nucleus before encountering their receptor proteins, not shown. The hormone receptor protein, activated by binding to the hormone, is now able to bind to specific regions of the DNA. These DNA regions are known as the hormone response elements. The binding of the hormone receptor complex has a direct effect on the level of transcription at that site. Messenger RNA, mRNA, is produced, which then codes for the synthesis of specific proteins.
So here's something to keep in mind. So the hormones that we're talking about here, epinephrine, for example, in the diagram, that particular hormone is very tailored to the shape of its receptor. Think of it like enzyme substrate. So it can only bind to its own receptors. But interestingly enough, depending on the type of cell that it connects to and the receptor that it binds to, can have differing effects depending on the signal transduction pathway that it then sets off inside the cell. So if we look epinephrine as an example of different cellular responses, we can talk about epinephrine attaching to your liver cell as opposed to your skeletal muscle cells. If we look at what it does in your liver, well, it's going to break down glucose and release it from the cell. But in your skeletal muscle, on the other hand, it causes those vessels to dilate. At the same time, we can take that epinephrine and attach it to slightly different versions of the receptor. So if that epinephrine binds to that skeletal muscle in a blood vessel, so the blood vessel is in your skeletal muscle, it'll attach to these beta receptors, in which case causing those vessels to dilate. But I go to your intestinal cells, and instead that epinephrine binds to an alpha receptor. And now, rather than making the blood vessel dilate, it actually makes the blood vessel constrict. And this is just an interesting way for your body to use one signal and create a variety of effects relatively efficiently, relatively quickly, given that this is a hormonal response, um, allowing your body to do a much more coordinated, efficient effort to get the response that it needs when it needs it. Your hormones can also fall into two additional categories based on the function of where that hormone gets created and where it gets used. And that's where we'll talk about the difference between tropic versus non-tropic hormones. So if I'm creating a hormone that directly regulates the function of an endocrine cell or an endocrine gland, meaning that the hormone works directly on something within the endocrine system itself, those are your tropic hormones. So FSH, LH, these are both involved directly in the release of eggs from the ovary and thus regulating your menstruation. So these would be considered endocrine targeted hormones, meaning that they're tropic. Non-tropic hormones, these are going to then directly stimulate other target cells to induce some sort of effect. So they're not going to work on endocrine glands. Instead, maybe they'll work on blood vessels or your muscle cells or something of that nature. So things like estrogen, testosterone, epinephrine, glucocorticosteroids, these are all non-tropics because they're not working directly on your endocrine glands. Instead, they're working on some other type of tissue in your body.